Thesis Weekend is a moment where the students come together and give us a big gift, the gift of their imagination. They imagine the world that is not there yet and to see what could be in the future.
My thesis title is The Theme, proposing a new typology for public space in a historical city that's defined that is a city in the middle of Iran that has two different public spaces. This thesis proposing a third one for this city by combining two other public space typology. It creates opportunity for people to see what happens in a government office.
My thesis project is titled Masking Agency, and it really tries to kind of subvert and bring attention to the act of masking in contemporary media. It's really about using image processing as a way to kind of generate form and to generate architecture. Really, the masking has the power to steal architecture from one context and another context and then kind of mash them together in a way. It starts to kind of decontextualize, but use gestures as a means of creating architecture.
My thesis is called Complexion. My thesis basically deals with a mode of working that offers the architect the ability to directly create, to be involved in kind of archetypal tectonics. This mode of working leads me into a live representation of model, dance, rhythm, movement, and a kind of violence that comes from striation of the human complexion.
One of our events that was always important every summer, it's an event in the last 5 years that we had, it was called Miniatures. The concept is, can you do a miniature model of what your project is going to be at the beginning of September? Miniatures was a way of asking the students to fast forward towards their thesis project.
The title of my thesis is The Architecture of Confection, a recipe for delight in the post-pandemic city. My thesis was aesthetic investigation of architecture through playing with materials, literal materials as in ingredients inside my kitchen, which I considered my studio. My project actually touches upon the typology of a playground, and I introduced this by placing my project on a site in the middle of downtown Los Angeles on the Angels Knoll Hill, proposing a playful landscape.
The perfect boyfriend builder is a way of looking at the built environment as a collection of scenes that we can begin to understand as portraiture of the spatial surround. If we look at architecture as a portrait, then we begin to understand things as certain references that go into making that portrait. Different objects and images, memories, all combining into this kind of mental construction of a space and the identity of that space, and then the identity of perhaps the people that inhabit that space.
My thesis is called Navigator, the Alienation. This thesis is establishing a tool that allows architects and designers to intuitively navigate the digital content and utilize the neural networks, which is composed of the contributions of architectural design from the internet and social media. The idea about the process is to translate all kinds of possible digital contents into architectural form.
My thesis is called Rabbit Hole. As the camera goes further into the space gains in complexity, but also becomes more and more disorienting. Every repetition is slightly different from the other, creating an array of multiple realities inside the same space. So as the camera moves, there's different discoveries in the space, and also there's a character that appears and disappears at some moment.
My thesis is called Zealots of Compton. My thesis orients itself about the ideas of the bounding box and how the sort of conditions we set upon ourselves, specifically the contextualized and site conditions, the idea of making the singular act in architecture that is just one building, I believe is no more, but instead multiple buildings within that bounding box to create these new realms for sort of community. The zealot fights for what the zeal is. And in Compton, that zeal is the revitalization of one's community.
My thesis is titled No Rise. The project sort of deals with a lot of questions about climate change and changes to economic models and societal models of how we live, envisioning a future where we've diverged from our built environment and instead we're kind of living in tubes and walls, but have awoken to a kind of new cultural currency, which is that of time and attention.
My project is called Life Support. Life Support is essentially an exploration of storytelling for me that adopts science fiction cliches and tropes and introduces an element of contamination that I call the ordinary that relates to a specific city, in my case, Los Angeles, and the dependency of a vehicle as a life support system in LA to get the effect that I want. So I ended up using a bunch of different and very new stuff that I've never done before.
My thesis I've titled The Behavior Game is an exploration of a custom software platform as a way for architects to develop their own tools, but simultaneously a way for me to explore new ways of deploying with and engaging with precedent works and assigning scripted behaviors to these precedents and then deploying them into a software simulation where they can begin to interact and sort of formulate their own becoming of architecture in space.
My project is called Imaging Memory. The opening scene of my animation is a forest that is textured with an AI manipulated image from a chapel. As you zoom out of the forest, it pixelates, and the pixelation shows that on the one hand you're actually looking at an image, but as it drops to the ground it becomes something else. It's the entrance into the memory.
My title of project is The Way. It's about designing a sequence of buildings which shape a route for urban pilgrimage. There are two precedents in my project. One is the Swan Bazaar and one is Karvansaray. And another strategies that I use is using the forms of calligraphy in tectonic way with making forms and models with changing of the calligraphic alphabet and calligraphic words to make and produce new forms.
The title of my thesis is Tremulous. I've been working on a renovation of the Los Angeles Metropolitan Courthouse. My thesis comes out of an observation in the architecture discipline of buildings where there's a discrepancy between the solid object of the building and the atmospheric effect of the surface that clads it. I wanted to make the tremulous effect an urban feature in the city. I took the courthouse and I put a giant hat on top of it. This huge, beautiful garden space that overlooks all of downtown LA.
My project called Body Drawing and Accelerated Space. I'm actually interacting in a green screen space, and I interact while being myself in movement and try to find a relation between all those pictures. For me, it was very important that my whole body start to draw. That's why I call it body drawing. I think this whole space is like some kind of like a virtual pavilion of like a new kind where everyone can experience it in a different way.
Thesis is by definition a moment where students question the world around them. They also want to reinvent, I think, the role of architecture in society.